It is great to have a Zoom visit on a beautiful afternoon. It is really great to see all of your wonderful faces. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 Redistricting Forum, co-sponsored by Open Democracy, Kent Street Coalition, Granite State Progress, and the League of Women Voters of New Hampshire. I'm Curie Claflin of the Kent Street Coalition. Some of you will remember the forum we put on back in March of 2018. We called it Citizen Action Against Gerrymandering. Granite Staters responded enthusiastically in the intervening 3 years to support good bills, to testify at hearings, to write letters to the editor, to participate in visibilities, just to name a few of the things we did. Today's forum also emphasizes citizen action, particularly as the 2021 redistricting cycle is literally upon us. Redistricting happens this year, so it's time to launch Citizen Action 2.0. There is now even greater sense of urgency to be active in support of fair maps. We hope to give you the tools to think about the process that we're about to go through in the most proactive ways. In my introduction to the program in 2018, I said that one goal of the sponsors was to take redistricting out of the realm of the abstract and wonky and to make redistricting sexy. We were pleasantly surprised that so many of you agreed with us. Indeed, we are very fortunate that this topic has energized so many wonderful grassroots activists and advocates for fair and transparent redistricting. So again, welcome to this socially distanced forum, and I hope that you leave today energized about the important work ahead of us. Now I'm going to hand this over to Olivia Zink.
Good afternoon. My name is Olivia Zink, and I'm the Executive Director of Open Democracy. As our founder, Granny D, said, democracy is something you do. And I want to thank you all for doing democracy and welcome you to today's forum. As Curie said a few years ago, we wanted to make redistricting sexy, and we did that with all of your help. So today, we have 103 of you joining us on this beautiful day. I know that 250 people responded, so maybe more will join us throughout the course of the 2 hours. And I wanted to just review the program for today. Zandra? So we'll have our keynote speaker. We'll learn the basics of redistricting. We will look at the history of redistricting in New Hampshire. We'll take a short break. We'll talk about the special committee on redistricting, talk about the software and the data and the math, talk about messaging strategies, and then we will end the day with actions that you can take to advance redistricting. Next slide. I just wanted to quickly review some Zoom basics. You can mute, please make sure you are muted so we don't hear the conversations in your home. So that's the corner button there. We also invite you to join us by speaker view. So you see the speaker. So you can do that in the top right-hand corner. And then also, we really do hope you are active in the chat. So if folks can put their name and where they're from, if they're part of one of the sponsoring groups, like mention you're a League of Women Voters member or member of Open Democracy or Kent Street or Granite State Progress, or all of them, if you're a member of all of us, and why you joined us. So just go ahead and start our chat going. And then, without further ado, I would like to introduce Ellen. Ellen is an attorney who spearheaded 2 redistricting amendments in Florida. She's the chairwoman of Florida Fair Districts now, an effort to get constitutional amendments. She is a fighter for redistricting reform. And what was really interesting to learn is that she also, prior to fighting for redistricting, really fought for women's rights within the Constitution in Florida. I hope you will be inspired by her work and her story to start our day. Without further ado, Ellen.
Well, thank you, Olivia, and thank you to all of you for asking me to join you this afternoon. I can tell you that it's not a huge sacrifice in Florida, but it sounds like it's a very huge sacrifice there in New Hampshire. I am thrilled to be with you. and I'm here to tell you a little bit about how we reformed the redistricting system or the redistricting process in Florida. So I got involved in this when I was in sixth grade. I was 12 years old. Now, I didn't really get involved in redistricting, but when I was 12, I won the contest for my elementary school of writing the best essay on what democracy means to me. And democracy really has been my passion from the time that I was a small child. And for whatever kept me going, it has been something that I've cared about passionately for my entire life. And that passion is what got me involved in redistricting, because I came to realize as an adult, much older adult, that that really without fair and transparent redistricting, you cannot have a properly functioning democracy. And that's really what I think why all of you are here today. And it's certainly why I'm here, having had the experience that I've had over the last more than a decade now. So in 2006, I was asked to join a committee of people who were drafting redistricting reform, a citizen initiative for redistricting reform in Florida. And that's in Florida, we have citizen initiatives, which if you gather a huge number of signatures and then you get over 60% of the vote, citizens can actually amend the Constitution. So I was asked to get involved in drafting these new amendments. And actually I was asked to chair this effort. I refused to chair it, but I did get involved in the drafting of these amendments. There had been many efforts before ours in 2006, or in 2006 and before, that had failed for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to go into, because I want to tell you about the one that succeeded. So I did agree to be part of this drafting committee, and before I knew it, I was the person who was keeping the drafting going, because the people who had been doing it before I joined, they would have a conversation, they would talk for a few minutes, they would decide on something, and then somebody will say, well, I'll send around the new draft. Well, the new draft didn't come for another 10 days, and it was going very slowly. So I ended up taking it over because I have no patience. So we got through the drafting, and the important part of this, and what I want to share with you, is how important it was not to make sure that we had input from all kinds of people, redistricting experts, redistricting legislators who had been through redistricting. And particularly in Florida, and I'm even in 2006, but I'm positive that this is true in every state now, that you really have to consult with all segments of the population, of the voting population, to make sure that what you're doing makes sense to them. So we drafted our amendments. I did end up chairing this effort. We gathered about 1.5 million signatures. And that was a totally daunting task. You can imagine, in Florida at least, if you're petitioning, it's not like a petition where there's a piece of paper and you get 20 signatures on one piece of paper. We had well over 1 million, actually 1.5 million, well over 1.5 million actual pieces of paper that had to be signed and then managed and then taken to supervisors of elections. And of course, there was a huge fundraising task that went along with this. Once we got on the ballot, we were opposed. I can't even begin to tell you how viciously we were opposed by the sitting legislature and some members of Congress. it was a really ugly scene. And they tried to, in fact, later on, I learned that somebody had investigated, that they had investigated me to try and find some dirt that they could smear the whole effort with by smearing me. Of course, that didn't happen because, I mean, they might have investigated, but they didn't, there is nothing. But, they didn't understand, these legislators and members of Congress didn't understand that I was doing this because I passionately believed in democracy and in making democracy work as it's intended to work. So we gathered these signatures, we ran a campaign that was opposed by the legislature, opposed by members of Congress, and to the tune of many millions of dollars. And we won. We won with 63% of the vote. So now I thought my job was over, but my job, it turned out, wasn't over, because on the night of the election, this was November 10th, November 2nd, 2008, on the night of the election, actually on the next day at 1:30 in the morning, 2 members of Congress and the Florida legislature filed suit in federal court to have these amendments held unconstitutional under the Florida Constitution. So when I woke up the next morning, that's when I learned about it. I didn't know in the middle of the night when they filed it, of course. And I learned that this lawsuit had been filed, and all of a sudden I realized that there was going to be a whole nother phase of this, because these people weren't giving up. The legislators, the politicians in Florida just weren't going to give up their power to perpetuate their own dominance in the state of Florida. So what did we do? We formed a new organization, a 501c3, for the purpose of litigation and defending the amendments. And that started in November of 2010 and continued until 2016. And let me tell you a little bit about that experience. We first had this lawsuit that did in federal court, which challenged the federal constitutionality of the amendments. The lawsuit, after about 10 months, we won completely. We won it at the trial level, and then we won on we won on appeal. So that went away. And then it came time for the legislature to start drawing districts. And we monitored very closely what they were doing. And it soon became very apparent, even from the things they were saying. They were saying that they were going to do the most open, interactive, transparent redistricting ever, and that they were going to follow the Fair Districts amendments, when in fact, what they were doing is they had hired Republican political operatives who were working in the Republican Party headquarters, both in Tallahassee and in Washington. And they were having those people draw the maps. Then what they did is they had to figure out a way to get them into the system without the public knowing. And so the legislature set up what they called a public portal, where where any member of the public could go online and actually draw a map. And they used that public portal to slip the maps into the system. And they told certain legislators which maps they were supposed to choose out of the allegedly publicly submitted maps. And what happened was that even the staff of the legislature wasn't told about this conspiracy, but the legislators and these political operatives knew exactly what they were doing. So a legislator would go to the staff and say, you know, I really like that one that was submitted from Joe Saunders in Gainesville. And they'd pull that one and they'd say, but I only like the northeast quadrant of the state. so let's pick the Northeast, let's put that together with another one that was submitted by somebody from Tampa. And then let's put together, and they cherry picked the maps that had been drawn by these political operatives, and they pasted it all together, and they created this totally gerrymandered map that actually was, in fact, exactly what had been drawn in the Republican Party headquarters. It took us about 5 years to uncover what it was that they had done. But we ended up, after taking scores of depositions and doing incredibly extensive investigative work, that we uncovered what it was that they had done. We proved it in court, and the courts threw out their maps. And then we came to the stage where new maps had to be submitted. And so the court ordered the legislature to go back and to follow the Fair Districts amendments and to actually draw new maps. And what the legislature came to was they could not agree, because none of them, well, not, I guess some of them, but most of them, the majority of them, couldn't agree on a map that was actually fairly drawn. And so what ended up happening is we came back to court, and the judge gave us the opportunity, gave all parties the opportunity to submit a map, and the judges actually made decisions about which were the most compliant maps that had been submitted. Turned out that the Fair Districts maps by our organization, the ones that had been submitted by our organization, are now actually in place. Now we're facing a new legislature, and we're facing a new redistricting process. And while we don't anticipate that the legislators are going to do exactly what they did last time, we are anticipating that they're not going to follow the Fair Districts amendments. We are not optimistic that they are going to do the right thing. We're hopeful, but I can't tell you that we're optimistic. What I can tell you is that the Fair Districts amendments that were passed, and I'm going to tell you exactly what they do. The amendments, which are now in the Florida Constitution, say that districts cannot be drawn with the intent to favor a political party or an incumbent. They also say that districts must be drawn to maintain the ability of minority voters, racial and language minority voters, to elect representatives of their choice and to participate fully in the political process. But they also require that districts be compact and districts follow city and county boundaries wherever they can, that they be as equal in population as possible, and that they be contiguous. So there are very specific requirements, very specific rules for the legislature to follow. It's going to be fascinating to see how they do it this time. We are coalescing with a group of probably 40 organizations in Florida, all of whom are committed to educating the public on the importance of redistricting and activating the public to communicate with their legislators to make sure that they understand that the public is watching. We intend to be watching. We intend to be working to let the press know what we find, and we are very hopeful that the maps that turn out this year, again, hopeful but not terribly optimistic, are going to be fairly drawn so that voters have a chance to actually select their representatives in a fair way, and so that the representatives aren't choosing their voters this year. So the themes that I would say that I can tell you from all of this experience that come to my mind are: number one, number two, number three, number four, and number five are how important it is and I think even more important today than when I started this in 2006, and certainly more urgent than in, I don't even remember what year it was, I'm not telling you anyway, but when I was 12 years old, and I won that contest about what democracy means to me. So democracy, first and foremost, but if you're working on redistricting reform or trying to accomplish fair redistricting, inclusion is so important. You must include every voter in your state and every community of voters in your state to ensure that the way the districts are drawn makes sense to everybody. I never could have gotten through this without optimism. I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to get through this cycle without it, but optimism and positive thinking obviously goes a long way, and tenacity, working as hard as you can and never stopping for a minute. And all of those things are things that I give credit to for keeping me going during all of this time. And I wish you all the very, very best of luck. And it sounds like you're on a wonderful track towards making sure that your legislature does fair redistricting in 2021 or 2022. I don't actually even know which year you guys will end up doing it. I know in Florida it's 2022. So Olivia, thank you for inviting me.
Oh, thank you for your wise words and your fight in Florida and those ingredients to keep us going. There's a few questions like about the legal fee and a few others, but I don't know if you would be willing to
of course
to chat back with folks in the chat, and we'll move our program along to Carrie Claflin.
Okay.
Zandra? Okay, thank you. Ellen, thank you for your inspiring, if harrowing, story. I think both lessons are good ones. For this segment on the basics of redistricting in the national landscape, we've got a short 7-minute video entitled "The Man Who Rigged America's Election Maps" about Tom Hoffler. It is a case study of North Carolina that also breaks down some of the basic concepts we should be familiar with. I promise it will take all the pain out of packing and cracking. Afterward, I will talk for a minute about the various methods of redistricting across the US. So first, the film. Zandra?
In 2018, Americans voted for who would represent them in Congress. But in North Carolina, the election results were really weird. These squares represent all the voters in North Carolina. They were voting for these 13 seats in Congress. About half voted for Republicans, and about 48% voted for Democrats. So you might think of the 13 congressional seats, maybe Democrats would have won 6 seats, and Republicans would have won 7. But no, Democrats only won 3 of 13 seats, way less than half. This imbalance was because North Carolina's congressional districts had been gerrymandered. It means that these voters had been grouped into districts very strategically, with the goal of benefiting one party. Gerrymandering has pretty much always happened in America. That's because every 10 years, the political districts are redrawn. And in most cases, those new lines get drawn by whoever holds power in state government at the time. That's what happened in 2010. Republicans won control of lots of state governments and redrew the political lines to favor themselves. And over the next few years, redistricting helped them hold on to almost all those states. This shifted the balance of power. And it turns out behind a lot of this was one guy.
Usually the voters get to pick the politicians. In redistricting, the politicians get to pick the voters.
This is Thomas Hoffler, the mapmaker who helped Republicans gerrymander districts over the last decade. When Hoffler died in 2018, his daughter found thousands of his emails and files, which she shared with activists. The files show that Tom Hoffler's fingerprints are all over the way America's political maps look today. But North Carolina was his masterpiece. And if you want to understand why gerrymandering is such a big problem in the US, that's a good place to start. The basics of gerrymandering are actually pretty simple. If you're a Republican trying to keep power, you want to do two things. First, pack as many Democratic voters as possible into a single district. If you have a district where almost everyone votes Democrat, that means almost half these votes are basically wasted. You can also crack big Democratic areas into separate districts where there are slightly more Republicans. So even though an area has a lot of Democratic votes, they would actually lose in this district and in this district. These are the two elements of classic gerrymandering, packing and cracking. And Hoffler employed these techniques masterfully in North Carolina. In 2011, he was hired to redraw the state's political lines, and for congressional districts, he came up with this map. Now I just want to focus in on District 12, this weird skinny shape. In order to make sense of this shape, we have to look at another map. This map shows the percentage of black people in each neighborhood. The bluer areas are where more black people live. Hoffler basically gathered up black people in Winston-Salem, Greensboro, and Charlotte, and packed them into one district. So that's how District 12 happened. Hoffler also did this with North Carolina state representatives and state senators. For example, here are the state senate districts. Here he packed Winston-Salem into one district, and then packed Greensboro into its own district. These new districts helped Republicans get a stranglehold on power in the North Carolina State House. And over the next few years, they were able to pass crucial legislation.
A strict new voter ID law in North Carolina.
Which bathrooms transgender individuals can use in North Carolina.
In 2016 and 2017, federal courts ruled that both of these maps were unconstitutional. They said what North Carolina Republicans did wasn't just gerrymandering. It was racial gerrymandering, done to deliberately dilute the political power of black people. The court said the Republicans in the North Carolina State House now had to redraw the lines without looking at racial demographics. So, they went back to Tom Hoffler. This time, Hoffler couldn't look at race. Instead, he looked at which areas voted for Democrats and which areas voted for Republicans. Instead of a racial gerrymander, it would be a partisan gerrymander. Here's that map, using data from 2014. The bluer an area, the more Democratic voters there are. Now, if you zoom in here to Greensboro, you can see one of the highest concentrations of Democratic voters in the state. Hoffler drew a congressional district line to crack this community in half. This meant Democrats here were now in the minority in their district, and Democrats here were also in the minority in their district. Hoffler employed these techniques all over the state to create North Carolina's new political districts. And the first big test for these new maps would be the 2018 election. Democrats were expected to turn out in droves.
Democrats are vying for a potential blue wave.
The wave that Republicans fear is going to wipe them out.
So, how did the maps do? For state representatives, Democrats got 51% of the vote. They only won 46% of seats. For state senate, they received half the vote and won just 42% of seats. And for Congress, you already know how that one turned out. Democrats won nearly half the votes, but won only 3 out of 13 seats. A year later in 2019, the Supreme Court weighed in. They said it was beyond their reach, that it wasn't their job to fix it. All of this raised an existential question. If Republicans could continue drawing the lines to stay in power, how could they ever be elected out of office? But the Supreme Court's ruling left open the possibility for state courts to rule on partisan gerrymandering. And in September 2019, that's exactly what North Carolina's Supreme Court did. The court found that partisan gerrymandering violated the state constitution. In the court's decision, it was Hoffler's files that helped prove that North Carolina Republicans drew these lines with the clear intention of benefiting themselves. Ultimately, the court said North Carolina Republicans had to redraw the state House and state Senate maps one more time. This new map, approved by North Carolina legislators, is much less biased toward one party, even though it took some extreme measures and nearly a decade to force politicians to draw a fair map. In the last few years, the courts in several states, like Florida and Pennsylvania, have made partisan gerrymandering much harder. And now that's also the case in North Carolina. Hoffler is gone now, but in other states across the country, many maps he helped draw are still in use. And while there's now a clearer strategy to challenge those maps in state courts, many voters are still effectively not choosing their representatives. It's like Hoffler said, the representatives are choosing the voters.
Of course, redistricting is democracy at work. Redistricting is like an election in reverse. It's a great event.
I'm back. Xandra, can you go to the map slide, please? Thank you. That's great. So now let's look at the methods that the 50 states are going to be using to create their redistricting maps this year. This map is from Ballotpedia, a great resource. The states in red, the majority, as you can see, are the states in which partisan-controlled state legislatures have primary responsibility for the redistricting process. New Hampshire is one of these 34 states. The legislature-driven process varies from state to state. For example, some legislatures may have an advisory or other type of commission to assist them. New Hampshire is not one of those. But as a general category, redistricting as the politician's task is the most common approach. The 13 states in yellow are the states that have established independent redistricting commissions to take this important task out of the hands of legislators. New Hampshire has tried to go this route, which you will hear about shortly, but we have not succeeded in getting a bill for any type of commission, independent or advisory, past the governor's veto pen. The 3 states in dark gray have hybrid methods for redistricting, which use different combinations of politicians, non-politicians, courts, and governors. So that's the 30,000-foot view of the national redistricting landscape in 2021. Now I'm going to hand this over to Liz Tintorelli, the president of the New Hampshire League of Women Voters.
Thank you, Carrie, and thanks for everybody coming. Our guests for the next 20-25 minutes are former New Hampshire Senator Sylvia Larson, State Rep Lucy Weber, and State Rep Ned Gordon. So please unmute yourselves and we'll keep going. Now we're going to talk about what happened in New Hampshire back in 2011. We'll discuss that process. We're going to look at the district maps that were developed then and are in use right now. And then at 3 o'clock, after we take a short break to let everyone stretch, we'll discuss the redistricting process that will happen this year. Let's put on the first slide because this is going to show the New Hampshire Senate districts that are currently in use. And if you haven't looked at these maps before, you may say, well, why is that first, the northern one so big and 2 and 3 are so big? Well, this is because the Senate districts, as with all the other districts, have to be the same in population, not in geographic size. And we're not a homogeneous state. We are far more rural up north, far fewer citizens, so that you look down at the southern part of our state and you've got some very tiny Senate districts. That's fine, all right? This was legitimate. Now, I'm hoping that Senator Sylvia Larson has managed to get on this call because Senator Larson was representing District 5 in 2011 when these maps were drawn, and she served on the Senate committee that was to do the district plans for the Senate. So if you're there, Senator Larson, would you tell us how this map was developed in 2011 and what your role as a Democrat on a committee in a year when Republicans were in the majority, what your role was that year?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you for coming, Senator.
Is my video on as well? I don't see that, but I had trouble because I'm in Florida and I wasn't getting on the big, so I'm only on my iPhone, so hopefully this will be substantial enough. I was on the redistricting committee and suffered through what was some very difficult committee meetings, and could watch what they were doing and felt very ineffective in being able to make any changes. Oftentimes the committee members, the Republicans, would be caucusing in a back room somewhere, and eventually they'd come out and they would talk through a district that they wanted to address, and you could see that they were working to front load as many Republicans into the districts that they could, and then of course dump certain areas full of Democrats in one congregated area. So we could see it happening. What's been interesting since then is that I've since learned, I suspected it, but I've since learned that the Republicans in Washington had created a $30 million program called Red Mapping, and they had figured out that they would target certain states where the state house leadership was close, and they targeted those leadership places to win Republican seats, so that in the redistricting year, they were lined up to be able to create the maps they wanted. I saw a statement on the Bill Moyers site, which is an interesting one to visit if you want to do a little research, but it basically said that under gerrymandering, the voters do not choose the elected official. In fact, in gerrymandering, the elected officials choose what voters they wanted. And that's precisely what was happening to us. But the other part that was very sophisticated on the Republican red mapping out of Washington was that there was this $30 million project to create algorithms through using some of the data from Facebook and social media and everything they could to identify likely new voters, but also to pull out their existing voters based on what they could tell of the backgrounds of the people that they had information on. So they recruited a lot of, it was obvious when you were standing at the polls, they recruited a lot of new voters to the polls, and they were very active in redistricting, in the redistricting committee to make it as fully loaded in Republican areas as they could. So there'd be times when they'd say, well, maybe we should put Antrim into district. I don't remember the exact number, but and then they'd run out of the room and look at the voting pattern of Antrim and run back in and say, no, we want to put Newport in instead. So those were the kinds of things that were obvious to us, but we did not know why they were, or where they were getting their data. And we were way behind. Now we know where they're getting it, but we're still probably behind. And we've been redistricted enough that it'd be tough to change it.
Well, let's look at the next map, because I think this shows that indeed what happened so 2010 was before this redistricting. Look at 2012, that the Republicans won only 48% of the election, and yet they got 13 of the 24 seats. So obviously what you just said, Senator, worked.
Yes.
And that happened in 2014 again, 2016, and even split just about in terms of the votes, and yet it was a 14-10 districting. So this was effective in the Senate. Could we see the next slide, please? Because in 2018, there was a big flip in New Hampshire. It was the first time that we had a Democrat majority in the Senate. The Democrats had 54% of the popular vote, got 14 seats, and now it has flipped back. So here we are in this crucial year of redistricting, and once again, the Republicans are in the majority, 14 versus 10 seats. Now, wasn't the Senate also responsible for the congressional district plan and presenting that and voting on it?
The House?
Yes.
Can we see that next map, next slide, please? So here is the two districts. You know whether you're in District 1 or 2 here. And what I've been told is that basically the sitting Congressman Bass and Ginta, both Republicans, worked to divide up the state in a way that would benefit both of them. And they also tried to get rural and urban mixed together. That was rather nice. And what could you comment about that? Did you as a senator have any input into this, or did it just come to you to be approved?
No, it absolutely arrived. We knew that Charlie Bass had weighed in on what districts he wanted, and we knew that they were precisely drawing the lines the way they wanted the districts to work. And there was no questioning or no allowance for us to speak up in a way that they were listening. So it was pre-approved.
From the House perspective, because I was actually under the impression that the House did the congressional districts, but the experience, no matter who ultimately did them, was exactly the same, because our committee chairman would come in, put his head in his hands and say, I just can't get the two of them to agree on what they want their districts to be. And without having read any of the political theory that we discussed earlier, I kept putting my hand up and saying, in what universe do we allow the politicians to pick their electors rather than the other way around? The one comment I will have is that although that's a fairly peculiar looking map, because it was being duked out between two sitting Republican congressmen, each of whom wanted the best possible district for himself, it was less awful than it might have been, say, if there were two sitting Democratic representatives and a Republican redistricting committee, which is where we find ourselves now. And certainly the head of the Republican Party has announced that one of those seats is going to be Republican next time around. We'll see where we get to, but.
Thank you, Representative Weber. That was Representative Lucy Weber, who's one of our other panelists for this. Xander, would you show us the next slide? Because this I found fascinating, going all the way back to 1981, red and blue, who won which district in New Hampshire. And obviously we were a Republican state for a long time, but where we've got this line going across in between the 2009, 2011, we see that that line got shifted a little bit, I'm afraid, on the graphic, but that's okay. That Frank Ginta and Charlie Bass, both Republicans, did this. And what happened the next year? Both districts went Democrat. So it does show that sometimes gerrymandering doesn't work. It always depends on who the candidate is, how hard the candidates work, the voter turnout. But this was their attempt to do it. And of course, now we have two Democrats in place. But over the years, obviously, we've had Republicans. Now, I do want to go on to talk about the House district maps. So can we see that next slide, please? And there was a lot of work going on behind closed doors, as we just heard from the senator and the representative. This is the current House districts, and I realize at this scale you probably can't even find your own town. But we know that New Hampshire has 400 representatives. If you take the state's population in 2011, divide by 400, you come up with that target number of 3,291 residents per representative. Now, clearly, towns don't have populations don't come in multiples of 3,300. So the House committee charged with drafting the House map had to make adjustments. Small towns were grouped together to get multiples of 3,300 reps. Big cities were entitled to multiple reps, either by breaking the city down into wards that could elect, a number of representatives per ward, such as Nashua does, or by voting for a number of representatives at large, which is what Laconia, Merrimack, Lebanon do. So it's up to the cities to decide how to form their wards. Now, our next speaker is Representative Ned Gordon. He's a Republican. And if you put up the next slide, we'll see where Ned comes from. And I hope Ned has unmuted himself here. Are you there, Representative Gordon?
I am here.
All right. So here is your district, isn't it? And you're from the town of Bristol, right in the middle of this. And you have 4 other towns in your district. And it's a long, kind of snake-like, salamander-like district, isn't it?
It is. It's a true salamander.
So tell us, now your town of Bristol was actually large enough to get its own rep, wasn't it?
It is. It has just almost exactly 3,300 people, and constitutionally should have its own rep.
But what happened? Why did it not?
Well, I'm not sure that there's a rational explanation for that, other than the fact redistricting, particularly when you have 400 districts, is not an easy process. So I can't really explain, and I wasn't there at the time to explain how it happened. I can tell you, though, that those 5 towns I represent have very different interests. So Ashland focuses on Plymouth. Its kids go to school there. Grafton focuses on the Upper Valley. Its kids go to Mascoma, and those towns in the middle go to Newfound. If I want to go from one high school to the other, I have to drive 40 miles. Grafton really has no connection to the other 4 towns. And the only way there's only one way to get to it. You have to drive through another county to get to it. And it's the same thing with Ashland. There's only one bridge over the Pemmy that gets to Ashland from the towns I represent. It's like, frankly, it's like having a Senate district in many ways, because the interests of the towns are very different.
And there are 2 other representatives that cover this area, because we also have that floterial that Enfield is part of. And, you know, with all these other towns that are added together, your district was able to elect 2 reps, correct? So basically your neighbors have 3 representatives they can talk to.
Right. You know, and when I talk to my colleagues in Concord, that's what they will say. And that, well, geez, you end up with 3 representatives instead of, Bristol ends up with 3 representatives instead of 1. But I can assure you that the people in Bristol would prefer, I think, to have their own representative.
Okay. And let's look at the next slide, because I want to show another version of what Representative Gordon just talked about. And that's the towns of Hudson and Pelham. And together they form Hillsborough District 37. Pelham has about 13,000 people, and Hudson is almost twice as big. Clearly, each of those towns was entitled to their own reps. They're big towns. But they were joined together, and they currently share 11 representatives. Pelham has appealed to the legislature several times, in my experience over the last 10 years, to separate them, because nearly all the reps that get elected there live in the larger town of Hudson. And whether there's a party bias or not, it means that Hudson knows its representatives and the reps know Hudson, and it's not true for Pelham. So the legislature, however, has refused to do anything about this situation over the several attempts over the years. And there are other towns like this, so we're not going to look at them, but we know that when this was done, Hudson was strongly Republican. Pelham was more of a purple state. By lumping them together, it was possible for the Republicans in 2011, who were drawing the maps, to be assured of more Republican representation. So as you said, Representative Gordon, there's no denying that districting 400 House seats is a hard task. And Representative Lucy Weber, do you want to talk about your district? I don't remember if I have a map. Do I?
You don't need a map. I represent the 4 Cheshire County, Connecticut river towns, and let me offer Representative Gordon my sympathy about his travel, but I don't go to the next county to get to the other end of my district. I have to go to the next state. So, and I have 3 towns, each of which under our New Hampshire Constitution is entitled to its own representative, and 1 smaller town. But we're lumped into a 4-town, 4 representative district because that makes the math work. Here's the thing that makes it so difficult in the New Hampshire House. Unlike most states which map by census block, we are required to keep towns together and wards together. We can't split them unless their voters have divided them up into wards. So that's item number 1 from the New Hampshire Constitution. And of course, the federal Constitution requires 1 person, 1 vote, which is where we get the 3,291 target number. And the fact is that you can do one, you can't do both. You just can't do both of them. So the net result in my area is we actually now have 4 towns and we have 4 representatives. And one of the representatives happens to be each of the 4 towns. So Walpole, entitled to its own rep, has one. But Westmoreland, which is half the size of Walpole, also has its own one. And we work collaboratively as a group, and we have done that, but I have the same issues of 3 different school districts. So, and although the constitutional amendment was intended to make us smaller districts, my district got bigger. I am now in a 4-member district rather than a 3-member district, although the district is more compact this time around.
So I just want to,
it's peculiar.
I want to ask you one more question, because we did promise everybody a stretch break in just a few minutes, and then we'll come back at 3 o'clock so everybody can get a fresh cup of coffee. But my question for you is, in 2011, when these maps were being shown to the public at those public meetings, what was their reaction? And I'm setting you up for this, I know.
That was a setup. We had a meeting early on to ask people what they wanted, and they came in and talked about communities of interest. And then there was a long period of time when nothing happened. And then what happened, there was some software. Nobody does software for New Hampshire because for the New Hampshire House, because of the floterial districts, it's too complicated. But there actually was some software that looked at that, and that was available to everybody on the committee for about 3 weeks, and then it vanished into the speaker's office and was not available. And what would happen eventually when they had a plan was that they would have a public hearing on the plan, and the chair of the committee would turn over the gavel to the vice chair. The chair then proceeded to the testimony seat, the public seat, and the chair read aloud the plan, all 200 and some odd districts, or however many there are, with his comments on each district. And I'm not sure there even was a map. There were just words on a page. I mean, you could read it. And by the time he got done testifying, which was some 2+ hours later, most of the members of the public who had come to testify had to go and take their babysitters home or get supper or go to their jobs. So there was actually very little public input. And I will say that at that time, of course, Democrats were only 1/4 of the House and 1/4 of the committee. And this time we are nearly half, and the Republicans are slightly more than half. And we have been promised that there will be more transparency and more public input. And although we don't really know what that's going to look like, you know, I am hopeful that that is a process that will be followed. The other thing we're up against, of course, is a very short timeline because the census is going to be very late. And I'm also not sure how we'll deal with that.
Well, as a member of the public observing this in 2011, I know I don't want the frustration of not having that information. And so I'm going to take the message from Ellen Friedin earlier and say, we've got to be optimistic that with a nearly balanced special committee this year, we can do better. So at
those
this
representations have been made, and you
Yes.
know, we have to all do, both members of the committee and members of the public, is to do everything we can to ensure that happens.
That's exactly right. So you're going to come back with us in about 5 minutes. We're going to let everybody stretch. They've been sitting here for an hour now. And we'll come back in 5 minutes and we'll talk about the process this year, 2021, and what we expect to see happen. So Zandra, put up our "we'll be right back" slide, and people don't log out. Just go and get your coffee and then come back. We'll be back in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Brother, brother, brother.
All right, let's resume. Boy, that was great to hear about 2011, but what we really are worried about is what's happening in 2021. And so our guests for this segment are two members of the special, I've got to say it right, Redistricting Special Committee, I think is the name of it.
Special Committee on Redistricting.
Thank you, Representative Weber. Special Committee on Redistricting. And that's Representative Lucy Weber and Representative Marjorie Smith. And as we know, Representative Weber was also on in 2011, and Representative Smith was on the 2001 committee. So we've got some experienced hands here. And thank you both for serving on this special committee. Now, I want to make clear that the committee to which you've both been appointed is a special committee of current legislators. It consists of 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats, because the Republicans have a slight majority in the House. And you're going to draft the new maps. The legislature will then vote on them, probably in January, if everything goes according to schedule, as provided in our Constitution. And then it goes to the governor, who can either veto or approve it. Now, I know that some of our attendees have heard the League of Women Voters and other organizations talk about independent redistricting commissions, but that's not what we will have in New Hampshire this year. However, not for lack of trying. So I'm going to start with Representative Smith, and the next slide, please. And I think I'm going to give away her talk here, but you were a sponsor of 2 bills that passed the legislature in 2019, 2020, with bipartisan support that would have created a nonpartisan commission of 15 people, none of whom would have been sitting legislators, to do this work. So maybe I gave it away, but what happened to these bills, Representative Smith?
What happened to these bills is not at all surprising. In each case, the House and the Senate agreed. The Senate on the first go round unanimously, but the governor vetoed, and that was the end of that. Actually, I've tried it 3 times because I also had one in this session, and in this session, the bill didn't even make it out of the House. So the governor was saved the use of his veto stamp. Didn't have to veto it.
Let's see the next
indications
slide.
at the beginning.
I'm trying to get the next slide up. There they are. Yeah.
Okay. And we also had a CACR. We had a Senate bill. The Senate bill was actually what had been the 2020 bill that I sponsored so there were 3 times, 2 different bills. We have a wonderful Republican member who tried to get through legislation that talked about how to go about it in great detail. That too failed. It is clear that the Republicans are not interested in anything independent, and they are following the guidelines of the Republican National Committee on Redistricting that's headed by the former governor of Wisconsin, who has a very good record of showing that partisanship is what matters most to him. And it was a great disappointment to me to hear that, to learn that Governor Sununu fell prey to that approach.
Somebody just asked in the chat whether it's possible to override the governor's veto. And
we tried to override the governor's veto twice, and it failed. It failed both times, and this time we haven't gotten a bill out of the House and Senate. The House killed one, the Senate killed one, and that's it. It's over. I do want to go back, Louise, to one thing that you said earlier about how we certainly hope we're going to have something to present to the House and Senate in January. I'm not sure that it's going to be possible to do anything by January, because I don't know when we are going to have the detailed census reports that make it possible to do anything other than determine how many seats each state will have in the United States Congress, and therefore the Electoral College. That figure we should probably know in the next couple of months. That's just the total population. But the actual breakdown, I mean, if we even begin to get those figures by the end of the summer, the beginning of the fall, it will be a surprise.
But there is
The
work.
whole system is delayed.
You're right. You're right. And so it may be that we have another late year, as we did in 2001, before we get maps. But
that may be, but you have to know, Louise, that yesterday, as part of the 3-day circus that the New Hampshire House went through at the Bedford Sportsplex, where in fact some of our Republican colleagues actually threw a soccer ball around, there was approval of a bill to change the date of the primary and to move it from September back to June, where the expectation is you would have to file for a seat in April. Now, to say that time has been compacted is being polite about it.
okay, so there is one big issue. The other thing I'd like to talk about this, for the benefit of many of our viewers who aren't quite sure what we need to do about all this, is the criteria that your committee is going to apply. Now, we know that they have to be all districts, whether it's congressional, state senate, House, or executive council, need to be nearly equal in population. And that criteria, we need the actual numbers for. And so that's one hang up. Another criteria is that the districts must be contiguous. So Representative Weber, what does that mean, that they've got to be contiguous?
Well, it literally means that they have to touch each other. And sometimes there are districts that touch each other only tangentially. And I don't know if you have a map that anybody could put up of the executive council district.
We do, so let's look at that. Next
I
slide,
thought you
please.
might.
You thought me, yes. Let's have the next slide, please, Sandra. There it is.
So there you have a prime example of contiguous districts. And I actually suggested that looked like a dragon one day. And within about 6 hours, Caitlin Rollo had drawn a picture of a dragon. And I didn't realize that the original gerrymander for Senator Gerry was also a dragon district. But this is a way of connecting, as you can see, all the Democrats in the Cheshire County area through all the Democrats in the capital area over to the Democrats in Representative Smith's Seacoast area. And, you know, District 1 is always going to look like District 1 because of the numbers. I mean, you can wobble the line back and forth a little bit, but that's just because that's how many towns it takes to make up a fifth of the population when you're dealing with the North Country. But the other three look a little peculiar. And if you look at the shape of District 5, it's not terribly it is contiguous, but not particularly compact, which I think is the next issue that we'll move on to.
And it is. So this is not compact. Now, District 2 was an example of packing as many Democrats as possible in there so that Districts 3, 4, and 5 would have a better chance of being all Republican. And it hasn't been perfect, but that's what we've got now. So compact would be a different shape. And that's something you're supposed to deal with. Not quite as important as the math, that they be equal representation, but it's another factor. Let's talk about one more, which is communities of interest. And Representative Smith, what do we mean by a community of interest? Can you give us an example?
Well, I think that the wonderful Representative Ned Gordon alluded to a problem in his district, which we saw was not compact, although it was barely contiguous. But he has 3 different school districts in his one district. The questions of rural and urban mix is certainly a relevant one. Although not as clearly defined in New Hampshire as it is in other states, there's certainly issues of race and religion. They're in rural and urban, as I say. There are a whole number of issues where people share a lot of common interests, common goals. And in all this, Liz, you haven't mentioned one thing that is also important, and that is between the 2010 and the 2020 census, the people of New Hampshire passed a constitutional amendment which said that if a district, in fact, had enough, if an area had enough population to warrant one representative, in other words, in using the 2010 figures, more than 3,291, they should have a representative. And we do not practice that, and we will not practice that because a number of cities refuse to draw ward lines that would make that possible for the larger districts. And I, for example, represent Durham and Madbury, and there are 5 of us in that Durham and Madbury district. Madbury doesn't have quite enough people for one, but we also have a flotarial district. And all of that is in violation of the constitutional amendment.
And at some point, we'll have to talk about flotarials, and I don't think we have time today. But let me end our little segment here before we move on by asking Representative Weber. This was the situation in 2011 that towns did not get their rep as they should have. Why didn't anybody protest?
We did, and we went to the New Hampshire Supreme Court. But because it is actually mathematically impossible to comply on the one hand with the requirement that each town is as close as possible to, each district is as close as possible to 3,291. and to keep town lines contiguous together. We can't divide up towns unless they've divided themselves into wards. And the third piece is the requirement that if you have more than the 3,291, you get your own district. Mathematically, it's impossible to do all of those things, which is why I represent a 4-member district with 4 towns, 3 of which are entitled to be their own separate district with their own dedicated representative. But, you know, it's mathematically possible for Westmoreland with far fewer people than any of the other 3 towns to have 4 representatives, although it's far more likely that what happens is the Hudson-Pelham problem, where Hudson is the big town and gets all the reps, and Pelham, being the smaller, gets none of the reps, or very fewer than they would be entitled to. We went to the New Hampshire Supreme Court and they said they were not going to set it aside. So I think they were very deferential to the 1 person, 1 vote principle, which I'm very much in favor of. But mathematically, you can't do all of them.
This is your challenge. And we have a couple of other members of the special committee here. Representative David Cody is on, and there may be others. And I just want to thank you all for what you're going to try to do. And as a member of the public and representing nonpartisan League of Women Voters, we really need transparency in this. If when you're doing this work, we can be part of it, municipal officials can weigh in about their communities of interest so that there can be logical groupings of towns, and so that the people can understand why it has to be drawn as it is. I think we can do a lot better than we did in 2011, and no map is going to be perfect, but that's our goal. So I think we're out of time for this. I want to thank you both for being here. And the next thing is that we're going to, let's see, I'm turning the program over to Olivia Zink and a very special guest to talk about some of the technology of redistricting. So thank you, Representative Weber, Representative Smith. Let's turn it over to Olivia Zink next.
Thank you both, and thank you, Representative Weber, for setting up the next part of the program perfectly. What's mathematically possible? And our next guest is Moon Duchin, who is a professor at Tufts University and runs a program around mathematics and redistricting. And her group, MGGG, which she'll tell you about, is really talking about how we can use math for nonpartisan applications in redistricting. And I'll turn the program over to Moon.
Okay, great. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. I'm here to tell you about some technology, but I also have some internet technology challenges. So if you lose me, I'll be right back. Okay, so as you heard, my name is Moon Duchin and I am a mathematician. So indeed, it was a great setup to talk about what is mathematically possible and mathematically impossible. And it is the case in New Hampshire and in many states that the way the verbatim language of the law describes something that can't be completely literally fulfilled. And that brings back to mind the sort of famous slogan that politics is the art of the possible. What I want to do today is, in a very short time, I want to tell you a little democratized, more intuitive, and hopefully put sort of the redistricting pen in the hands of the people in a way that wasn't possible even 10 years ago. So I really, in particular, I got a lot out of Lucy Weber's story that 10 years ago, there was officially public input on the redistricting plan, but the way it played out was a representative, reading the legal definition of the plan for 2 hours and making it hard for people to actually figure out how to contribute. Okay, so let's take a look. First, a little bit about my lab and what we do. So we're a data science lab whose mission is to help good government reforms and to support civil rights organizations. We were formed in 2016, and our original theme was just exactly this, gerrymandering and sort of using interventions to try to understand how to build better maps. So we've built a software tool that I think is, you know, a pretty exciting innovation, I hope, because we've been building it for over 3 years. It's called districter.org, and you can check it out. And here's what it does. It gives you the ability to start anywhere in the country, and you can do two things. You can draw districting plans, or you can identify communities of interest, which is one of those crucial ideas we were hearing about in terms of the criteria. So whether you want to draw districts or draw your community, you can do that in all 52 states, I smilingly say, because we have DC and Puerto Rico, as well as the 50 actual US states. Okay, so what is, you heard a little bit about contiguity, which says the district should be connected. Compactness, which says they should look nice, they should be reasonably shaped. Population balance, maintaining political boundaries like town lines and ward lines. But then there's this, you know, all of those rules can actually be surprisingly vague or hard to pin down, and they're full of tension. So sometimes you can't satisfy everything all at the same time. But the tensions are never more apparent than for this one principle, respect for communities of interest. It's been the vaguest and the most intangible for decades. So it sounds great, the idea, as you heard from Representative Smith, that when there are shared interests, goals, and values, in short, when there are shared representational needs in a neighborhood or community, then this should be taken into account by the people drawing the lines. So if you have a group that has certain needs, the lines should be drawn so as to foster the conditions that give them a voice with their representative. Sounds great, but how do you do it? So here's my little cartoon that fits perfectly well with what you've been hearing about. You know, for many cycles, we've understood that it's important to hear from the public. And so there will be hearings and community meetings. On the other hand, it's the legislature, or sometimes the court, or sometimes a commission that actually does the line drawing. And the question is, how do you connect these to each other? There's been a linkage problem where the information that comes out of hearings and community meetings, it's hard to make that concrete and visible in a way that's actionable by the legislature, court, or commission. And so here's where kind of the data comes in. So if you introduce software, if you work with geographically rich shape files, if you get your hands on the data, you can transmit information that you collect from the public into a form that can be actionably used by the line drawers. And so the idea is that this makes this connection, this makes good on an idea that's been hard to sort of make real in the last several cycles. Okay, so the idea here is that many different kinds of communities need a voice. And my lab, we're doing work around the country to try to help amplify that voice. So we talk to folks in Chicago, where the community called Little Village has lots of needs to do with gang violence, policing, and environmental justice. We've talked to onion farmers in Georgia. And right up the road from where I sit in Greater Boston is Lowell, Massachusetts, that recently redistricted. And their community members were trying to tell the city council to pay attention to their needs, better lighting in the park, listen to community input for where to relocate the high school. These kinds of questions, these kinds of concerns weren't being heard. And through use of various kinds of tools, but in particular through use of Districter, ultimately the communities were able to communicate with the expert brought in by a court to redistrict Lowell for the very first time and take that input into account. So I consider this a real success story in the use of technology to make good on COIs. So in general, the message is public mapping helps you make your voice heard. Okay, and so I invite you to check out the tools. You can read about our lab at mggg.org. The tool itself is at districter.org. But here's the big one, it's in the blue box. I want to invite you to come to trainings. We hold trainings every Monday and Wednesday. On Monday, we tell you what are COIs and why are they important. And on Wednesdays, we help you draw them. These are open, they're free. We'll be running them all spring and summer. And so you're all cordially invited to come and become a community mapping expert, and then propagate that knowledge out through your networks around the state. Okay, so I'll stop this screen share and I'll switch to showing you a thing or two about Districter. But first, I want to see if there are questions that have come in on the chat that I can address. So one asked if we use AI. Yeah, actually, so our lab is on the kind of cutting edge, I think, of understanding what's possible in redistricting by using techniques called Markov chains. So that's like fancy math being used to show you what is and isn't possible. And that's not part of the community mapping project, but it's a big research focus for the lab. Someone asked, Jim asks, does including communities of interest actually give republics, presumably Republicans, a rationale for packing? So this is a great point. Just because you identify communities of interest doesn't tell you how they're going to be used. But you can't hear about what people think is important without having a venue for asking the question. So yes, of course, it's absolutely important after all this input has been collected to think about how it'll be used. But step one, make your voice heard. All right, great. And so I'll just switch my screen share for a moment and a little bit looks like to take a look at New Hampshire in Districter. Okay, so here we are. Oh, so if you go to districter.org, the front page will give you an option to, as you saw in my screenshot before, you can choose anywhere in the country. And if you pick New Hampshire, we'll tell you just a little bit about the redistricting rules in New Hampshire. We'll tell you that indeed, like you heard before, your flotorial district system makes it really hard for us to represent House districts in the tool. But nonetheless, we let you draw congressional districts, executive council districts, or state senate districts. So you can choose to draw those, or instead of district drawing, you can switch to communities. And then you can, using units of either block groups or precincts, you can draw your community and say what matters. So if you have two particular towns that should be kept together, this is an opportunity for you to go in, grab those towns, paint them in, and put in a narrative that says why they should be kept together. If your town should be on its own to have its voice magnified, this is a venue for you to send that message as well. And so I'll let this load. It takes a moment. It's all done in the browser. And I want to say, by the way, perhaps you've noticed, there's no account, there's no login, there's no username. Everything happens in the browser. We don't collect any information about you when you draw. This is really meant to be kind of a tool for you. And so if you start drawing and you grab some towns and you want to say, keep us together, and then you could describe why. It's important to keep these towns together because ... Okay. And then right up here, there's a share button, and that lets you take whatever map that you've drawn and you can share it however you want, by email, on Twitter, or in public comment to the legislature. Okay, that's the basic idea. The last thing I want to show you, because I want to keep this brief, just while listening to some of the other great speakers, I drew myself a plan for New Hampshire. I balanced the population pretty closely. And what I want to show you is that in the software, because we have some election data already preloaded, I could sort of see how this would play out if people voted as they did in various recent elections in New Hampshire. And so, for instance, if I put in the Clinton-Trump 2016 election, what I could see is these two districts that I drew without looking at the partisan data at all. In fact, they do something kind of nice. One of them would have been a Democratic advantage. One of them would have been a Republican advantage, both fairly close to the overall state proportions and both fairly competitive. Okay, so the point is, this tool is intended to put the information that you need to understand the properties of your districts at your fingertips. And we have an active development team, and we'll be working all summer to make this available and useful in as many states and places as we can. Okay, so I think I started at about 3:20, so I should be winding down in the next minute or two. But since I have 1 or 2 minutes left, I'll ask if you have any questions. I see Liz has written in the chat that floterials are a fudge factor to make the House districts work out. I agree. The floterials are intended to try to balance things using the pieces available to you and then to correct for the inaccuracies. So it's an innovative tool to do that, but it introduces a whole lot of complexity into the math. All right.
Thank you so much, Moon, for joining us today. And we encourage everyone to go to the MGG trainings and learn more. And we are going to do our own mapathon here in New Hampshire in May too. So we'll be doing lots more around this software. And thank you for making these amazing tools available to the public.
Great, it's my pleasure. So I'm putting in the chat right now. You can contact us at districter@mggg.org, or you can come to our trainings, and the flyer that tells you how to sign up is located here. All right, thanks everyone. Great to see you. Hope to hear from you. Take care.
Thank you so much, Moon. And we'll turn the program over to Brian and Zandra on messaging strategies.
Here. I'm Brian Beal. I'm Olivia's deputy, and we're Xander and I are going to spend a couple of minutes about how to talk about redistricting and gerrymandering. There are ways that we can approach this topic and be able to communicate what we want to achieve without dwelling on the things that people might not agree with us on. So if we could have the next slide, Xandra. It's very important as we talk about redistricting that we are very consistent in our messaging and that we're portraying a very positive message about what redistricting will do to help an average voter. Redistricting is a very wonky subject, and we want to make it so that people understand the basics of this, understand that gerrymandering is a bad thing and why it's a bad thing, but also to motivate them to, and Kyrie Kaplan just said, no redistricting is sexy. So I'll repeat that. That's the positive, right? We want to make sure that we are communicating to the public that they need to speak up. So as we write letters to the editor, as we are talking in our communities, as we're doing Facebook and other social media posts, it's really important that we continue to use a consistent positive message. And people will begin to see that what we're talking about is the way to go, as opposed to some of the shady things that have happened in the past. So redistricting is going to shape our future over the next 10 years. So we have to make sure that we are doing this right, that we get people involved, and that we are making the change that's necessary. Granite State, New Hampshire, our voters, they should have equal representation in our legislature. Next slide, please. So we have heard a lot about, coming out of Georgia and Texas and North Carolina, about the gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering, trying to manipulate the maps to partisan advantage. Our message has got to be that we are attempting, in the changes that we're looking for fair, nonpartisan redistricting, that all of our voices are heard, no matter the color of the skin, where they are in New Hampshire. And as we know, age is a factor as our students are concerned with the voting rights bills around the state. We talked about communities of interest. I'm not going to dwell on that, but we need to include those as part of the process. And we shouldn't be using partisan data to manipulate the maps. And the ultimate thing is to make sure that we have a transparent system. And thank you to our legislators who talked about how that system was manipulated in the past. And we know that we need to have this. We know that there are legislators who do not want a transparent method. And we would like to make sure that we are telling the state, the voters in the state, that they need to demand that from their legislature. Next slide, please. We need to communicate to voters that their voice, that partisan redistricting suppresses a voter's voice, and it makes a person's vote not matter as much when they have been packed into a district full of Democrats. It hurts towns because a town, if it doesn't have the proper representation, and as was described, there are towns like Hudson and Pelham, where Pelham has very few representatives. And so they are underrepresented in Concord because of what Liz Tentarelli calls partisan gerrymandering, as opposed to, or partisan redistricting as opposed to gerrymandering. It doesn't look like it because it doesn't have the squiggly lines, but it's gerrymandering nonetheless. And then overall, it hurts our state policies because the representation doesn't represent the people that it serves. Next slide, please. So another big issue here is the number of towns that didn't receive their constitutionally guaranteed New Hampshire House district. This is a winning message for moving a fair redistricting process forward. As we have done our New Hampshire resolution for fair nonpartisan redistricting, this has been popular even in the reddest of towns, most conservative of towns, where everybody recognizes that towns should be properly represented and they should receive these districts. It's not easy, but it can be done, and we're already working to try and make that happen, and more on that later. Next slide, please. So there's been a lot of bad information that has been uttered by very senior officials in the New Hampshire state government. And it is very tempting to say, to respond directly and to post videos and news articles. Don't do it. The logarithms in Facebook and Twitter and in Instagram will elevate bad information and instead of the good. So what we want to be doing is we want to be posting and sharing information from our either our groups or reliable sources. League of Women Voters is an Open Democracy, and Kent Street all are going to be providing you with good information. But when you do that, do it from your accounts and elevate from your accounts as opposed to somebody else's bad information. And to keep that drumbeat going, we're going to be constantly giving you material to put out. So another thing that we've heard a lot from senior officials is there's not very much gerrymandering in New Hampshire. Don't worry about it. Move along. Well, in fact, there, as we've discovered, and frankly, I didn't know this until earlier this year, that because of the what Liz Tentarelli calls the partisan redistricting of the House districts, gerrymandering doesn't have to be squiggly lines on the map. Up here where I live in Alton Bay, Alton and Gilmanton are connected for no particular reason, even though they're both eligible for their own state house districts. You have to look at the math behind. And it's so this is a way for you to respond when you have people say there's no gerrymandering in New Hampshire. Well, there is, and you have to look at more than just the squiggly lines, and you have to look at the math behind it. Just looking at the dragon in the executive council isn't the whole story. Next slide, please. So we also get a lot of response from, and this came up a lot in the New Hampshire resolution effort in the last couple of months, is we got elected, we make the rules. But what we're seeing is that there's a difference of opinion between those legislators and the voters, the citizens in those towns who are passing the New Hampshire resolution in large numbers. We are 46-3 as of today, and including many red towns. This is just a few towns that have conservative bent, who are recognizing that they want a nonpartisan process. And it's good to remind our legislators and all voters that the legislature is elected to serve everybody. Next slide, please. We're not going to dwell on the past. So even though we've talked a lot about 2011, whether you're talking to elected officials or you're talking to voters, don't spend a lot of time on the past. It tells us that we need to do our work, but we also want to call for what we want, which is a fair, nonpartisan, and transparent system that is going to create maps that benefit everybody, not just a few. All right, I'm going to turn this over to Xandra and let Xandra continue on with the discussion.
Yep. So I'll pick up from here. What Brian was just saying about for electeds and for the general public, dwelling on the past isn't our best message, because we want to talk about what we want to see going forward, and really our top line message, which is around what we need to see out of redistricting, and the fact that this will really shape our districts, our elected officials, and our public policies for the next 10 years. So if we get too mired in the public message around the inside track, then we're going to lose that top line message that we really want people to take away from it. But for activists, we do want folks to understand what the dynamic is, and to use what has happened, not just in New Hampshire, but around the country, as urgency to get involved. So just want to be clear, we've got kind of two pathways here, depending on which audiences we're working with. So again, that top line message for everyone is redistricting will shape our districts, our elected officials, and our public policies for the next 10 years. Granite staters deserve a fair, nonpartisan, and transparent redistricting process that guarantees them the full representation they are due. Now, when you're trying to get people involved and activated around this, what we want to talk about from the past is that that 10 years ago, the process was done in secret. And the big important part to emphasize here is it denies at least 62 communities the representation they are due. Because that process was not fair, was not transparent, we have communities who should have their own state representative who do not have that opportunity to do that. And as we talked earlier in the program, that really harms the ability for those communities to have their values and their priorities represented at the state house or at any level of the ballot. That flawed plan was passed over the objections of communities, citizens, and outspoken elected officials from both sides of the aisle. We want to emphasize that most people agree that redistricting should be nonpartisan, that we should live free and map fair in New Hampshire, and that's why we need to work even harder to make sure this year's process is done right. And the catapult here for the urgency for people to get involved. Partisan political interests will do everything in their power to draw lines based on political gain instead of communities of interest. We need a fair, open, and transparency in redistricting process that ensures that voters pick and choose their elected officials, not the other way around. And I will say, when we were talking about some of the messaging from across the nation and what would work best here in New Hampshire as we go forward, this particular phrase, voters pick and choose their elected officials, not the other way around, that really is important. And you saw in that video from the experience in Pennsylvania and how some of these maps have been drawn in the past, how the process has not gone as it should and what the impact is there. So we really want to make sure we emphasize voters get to pick and choose their elected officials, not the other way around. And then there's a couple of things that happened recently that really highlight how important it is that we pay attention to this process. Obviously, you're all here on a nice Saturday, sunny afternoon and understand that. But for people who are less tuned into what's happening, we know that we already have rumors of potential gerrymandering in the congressional districts. And we know from the experience in the past that New Hampshire is supposed to have communities represented through our large and diverse 400-member state house, and that if we don't do this process the right way, then that is compromised. So again, redistricting should be fair and nonpartisan and provide effective representation. Our goal is to ensure voting maps are not gerrymandered to favor a political party or candidate, that communities of interest are considered when redistricting, and that the process for redistricting should be transparent and open to the public input in all stages. And you saw that we use this line, let's live free and map fair, to ensure New Hampshire communities receive the full fair representation they are due, because this will shape our policies, our districts for the next 10 years. And with that, I will turn it back over to Brian, Luis, and Liz.
So I am here at Open Democracy. I am the prime organizer for the Open Democracy teams. And each week our teams are given actions that they can pick and choose from, and will take small but powerful actions. And we've prepared some of these for you, but we also want to give you a sense of why getting involved is important. So I'm going to turn this over to Louise to say a few words about that. Louise?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And as we've been hearing, one of our biggest challenges is getting the message out to the public. We heard about that from Ellen in her opening statements today, which was terrific. And we're hearing that from each of the speakers, that what we need to do is take the passion that we're feeling right now, and that brought us in on a sunny day to participate in this important forum, and help other people understand the urgency of this as well. And the way that we do that really is by working together. And that's why these organizations have come together to plan this forum, because there's more power when we work in coalition with one another, when we work in connection with one another. So we're really urging you to join up with one or all of these organizations in their efforts to focus on redistricting. What we really need is for you as individuals, know your communities better than people across the state. So we need you to take what you know about your communities and bring it out to this work, and then bring the work back to your communities. So thank you.
And I think I speak next. On this page.
Xander, if you could scroll down a little, please.
On this page, you'll see the National Day of Action. The National League of Women Voters is using redistricting as a nationwide priority this year. And they chose April 29th, on or about, I don't care if it's on either side of that by a few days, as a day when all of us who care about fair maps, about transparency and redistricting, do something to try to move forward with optimism and vigilance in the redistricting process. So we have various suggestions on this page. We have more suggestions and brainstorming session on the League of Women Voters New Hampshire webpage, so that if you've got an idea of what people could do to try to move this forward, go to that webpage. I think all of these are linked, and you're going to get this in the materials after the program. So try to join one of these organizations, try to participate in the Day of Action. Just do one thing, as simple as contacting your own legislators and telling them that you want fair maps, you want districting to represent your communities of interest. Try to find out what your communities of interest are. What makes your town what it is, and how does it relate to the neighboring towns? Talk to your elected officials locally, your school boards, and so on. So I don't want to go through this whole list. I don't know if Brian is going to do that a little more methodically, but I'm urging everybody to do something.
Great, Liz. Thank you. Xandra, if you could scroll down just a little bit and show us number 3. So action number 3 is, I mentioned this earlier, we have the New Hampshire Resolution for Fair Nonpartisan Redistricting that we are attempting in 100 towns total between last year and this year. And trying to get voters to sign on to a resolution and vote for a petition warrant article in our town meeting and town election, SB2 towns, and trying to get resolutions passed in the cities. Currently, there is one pending in Nashua that's going to be voted on this coming Tuesday. So if you are from Nashua, make sure you reach out to your alderman. But there are several ways to get involved in this. And if you do have one of these in your town, you can check your town warrant. There are town meetings still scheduled for April, May, June, and I think the last one is in Rye in July. So we have a ways to go. And by writing an LTE, trying to talk it up in town through social media, and then by all means go to town meeting and vote. That's one of the real critical things. So if you could scroll down to action number 4, Xandra. So action number 4 is I mentioned this earlier, we are going to start to try to reach out to towns that don't have their own town New Hampshire House District, and get citizens from your community to speak up to the Special Committee on Redistricting and ask for it. And in particular, we may be asking you to write a letter, to go to your select board meeting, and to get your select board to communicate directly with the Special Committee. There's nothing more powerful than a municipality coming to the Special Committee and saying, we're not being properly represented. We want this to happen. So there are different steps here for you to get involved in that process. And if you could go down to action number 5, please. If a town has its own house district, there are other things you can do by trying to speak in general terms and get the community behind a statewide effort to uphold our New Hampshire Constitution. So we have some sample letters there for you to consider, but we would like you to write something that's authentically from you. And then I was asked this afternoon to also put in a plug for the For the People Act. This is a federal law that most of you are probably have heard a little bit about in the last few weeks. So it has passed, the For the People Act has passed the House. It is in the Senate, and they are wrangling with whether or not to change the filibuster rules to be able to move this forward. But S1 needs to have a call from you and from your friends, not only in New Hampshire, but all over the country, to call your senator and to support this bill. And if you scroll down a little further, we have provided some social media that we've been running on open democracy, and these are Twitter and Facebook and Instagram friendly messages. One is, it does include, HR 1 does include an independent redistricting commission that will oversee the congressional districts, unfortunately not until 2030. But we're hoping that that could be implemented and be a good demonstration for the state of New Hampshire about how effective an independent redistricting committee can be. And next, scroll down a little further, please. And then our action number 7 is the putting yourself on the map. This is our Fair Maps, Live Free Fair Map Fair project, where you can actually take what Moon Duchin was talking about and get involved and start to create maps. We have a couple of volunteers that are working on this already, and we're making some progress in being able to make sure that all towns who are eligible can get their own state rep district. So it is possible, but it's hard, and it's going to take a lot of negotiation. And we want to look at this. We want to get people involved from all over the state. So scroll down to the next action, please. And I want to turn that back over to Louise.
Hi, yes, thanks, Brian, and thanks for all those great ideas. We really hope people will join us. A lot of these ideas are very collaborative between the groups here today and some of our other partners that are also committed to fair redistricting and also to voting rights. So we invite you to join us. I've put links in the chat so you can check out each of the organizations. Kent Street Coalition, we have our voting rights, redistricting, and campaign finance working group, and you can find more information about how to join on our website. Brian mentioned the Open Democracy teams. Again, the link is there. Granite State Progress, I urge you to check out all of their amazing work, both on redistricting and democracy issues, but a host of other issues as well. And of course, the League of Women Voters, who has been doing this work for so very long and brings so much expertise and experience. And so please make sure to go to their website as well. And let's support the work of these fine organizations in whatever ways we can by bringing our talents and resources. One thing we wanted to make sure to stress is we've put some ideas forward on our list of actions, but we really need you, and we need your creativity, because that's how we're going to figure out how to really reach people. This is a time for us to think about, what is it in our community? What is it going to a farmer's market? Is it attending an event? Is it doing a visibility? Is it speaking to your local, sending a letter into your local town crier, going on chat rooms? We need all of your ideas, and we need each person here to come together so that we can make this happen and so that we can win fair maps. We've heard about the barriers and the obstacles that are facing us, but together, if we come together and work together, we have the power to make change, and I believe we can do this. So with that, I will turn it back over to Xandra and to Kiri to wrap us up.
Thank you, Louise and Xandra and Liz and Brian. So there's no shortage of stuff to do. But many, many thanks to all of you for attending this forum and for giving redistricting 2 hours out of this lovely afternoon. Much gratitude also to our wonderful speakers who generously shared their experience and their knowledge with us. most people, regardless of party affiliation, share our values on fair, nonpartisan redistricting. Both state and national polls show that the majority of voters want fair maps. So we here at this forum now have an opportunity to make real difference in New Hampshire by reaching out to our neighbors, family members, and communities and letting them know that it is only by demanding transparency from our legislators throughout the redistricting project that we will achieve our common goal of fair and equal representation in the Granite State. And we must be, as Ellen said so well, positive, tenacious, and above all, optimistic. I don't know, they're all above all. I believe that our shared value of one person, one vote is within reach if we make it happen. Olivia?
Today just starts the action we needed for fair districts this year. And so you were presented with 8 options. Please put the action you want to take today. So just being here today, we want you to continue to think about what you can do in your own community to make a fair district. So feel free to type a note in the chat, make a commitment today of what action you want to take. You know, those 8 actions are there on our webpage. I see people saying they're coming to the Mapathon on May 18th. Yes, this program will be recorded. The handouts for the program will all be distributed to all of you in the email afterwards. And there's lots of little links in the action page too. So each action, you know, if you want to look up which of the 62 towns, it's all in there. So any other actions people are going to take, put them in. I'd love to see them. Doing a presentation in your community, going to a farmer's market, passing resolutions, writing letters to the editor and posting social media, writing to your state senator. All of these are so critical, important actions. I want to thank you all for being with us today and for taking actions, and wanted to wrap the program for the day. Thank you all so much for being with us. And we'll say goodbye.